9. Got a funny case here, Sarge, said Fatty Hardy. The sergeant groaned. More than boners or the coming invasion, he dreaded Fatty Hardy's funny cases. Pinched sandbags, missing machine guns, haunted houses. The constable was a lunatic. What is it this time? It's a woman with a funny story. Let her in to tell it then. I haven't had a laugh in weeks. I didn't mean a joke, Sarge. Hardy looked baffled. Oh, send her in and go. The one perched herself on the edge of a chair like a bird, clasped her hands and closed her eyes. Let's pray, said Sergeant, before he could stop himself. It was a tiredness that he did it. Let us pray indeed, young man, for there are the latter days when the foul beast shall be loosed from the pit. Book of Revelation, chapter 13, verse 11. Oh Lord, thought the sergeant, she's one of those. Was more, the sergeant of the foul servants of the foul beasts have been machine gunning my mother. Your what? Gasped the sergeant, nearly falling out of his chair. 3 days ago, as I lived and breathed, I was just taking mother her cup of tea, and was ready to look her for the good book, when something came through our roof and smashed the God is love that hangs over her bed. What sort of somethings? Asked the sergeant cautiously. The woman dug in her purse and dropped a flattened bullet into his hand. The sergeant could see it wasn't British. What happened then? I ran to the window and saw their fearsome machine fleeing God's wrath, going straight up into heavens. A strange choice of directions, thought the sergeant, but got his tongue in time. German! It bore the crooked cross. The sergeant tossed the bullet thoughtfully up and down. It had been that German fighter that exploded all right, the one everybody called the tea-time sneaker. Where do you live? Simpson Street. Across the river. Are you the war damage? Am I what? The war damage, Mrs. Spink. And if I reported it to war damage, they'll come and mend the hole in our roof and give us a new God is love. Madame, I am not the war damage, but leave your dress that I will send round the man who is. The woman sniffed and left. The sergeant had on. It didn't make sense. The tea-time sneaker had been a reconnaissance man, relying on stealth. Why should it open fire on a street miles from any military target? Nervous rear gunner. But Simpson Street lay at right angles to the sneaker's flight path. Even a nervous rear gunner would not turn his gun through 90 degrees of slipstream before going trigger happy. Were they all mad in the plane? It had climbed vertically immediately afterwards, which was a mad enough thing to do, or had something upset a normally steady crew. Something like being fired from the ground by a machine gun. His bullets missed and landed among houses across the river, but they were German bullets. The sergeant banged his fist on the desk and swore. That missing machine gun, what a fool he'd been. The sergeant surveyed the God is love and a line of bullet holes. The text was not alone on the bedroom walls at Simpson Street. God bless this house with a border of blue kittens and pansies hung above the empty fireplace. Thou, God, seest me stitched around a large and malevolent eye hung over the door. Not only God's eye surveyed the sergeant. The bright beady eyes of the old lady in the bed followed him everywhere. Avengary fag. Have ye? I've right gasping. She won't let me have 'em, you know. Says they're ungodly. Her and her God. She's potty, you know. It's a case where a poor old body can't have her deathbed comforts. The sergeant offered a bent woodbine and lit it. She sucked in smoke. Her face wretched, wreathed in a beautiful smiles, like a baby having its bottle. That's the first this week, Mrs. Davis, slippy one when she calls. She's laid me with her sciatica. Where did you put the ash? Asked the sergeant nervously. The old lady pointed on the rose-wreathed chamber pot under her bed. Last time the doctor's come to test me watery, nearly had a fit. Excuse me? Said the sergeant. He must get on with his job. He tied a piece of string with a weight on the end to the bullet hole in the ceiling. Then he must put his head against the shattered God is love and looked beyond the string, through the window. He was now looking down through the path the bullets had come. They had come from a clump of trees across the river, with a chimney pot sticking up through them. Help! Gasped the old lady, breaking into a paroxysm of coughing. The sergeant thought she was starting a fit. Her eyes were swivelling mildly, but he finally realized she wanted him to take the cigarette. He had just taken it when the daughter burst in. The old lady must have hearing like a radar. Smoking, said the daughter triumphantly. Her eyes lighted on the woodbine in the sergeant's hand. The whole room stinks like the foul pit. I told him you wouldn't have smoking, said the old woman, but he wouldn't heed. He took advantage of me lying here helpless. So, you say, I think my own thoughts about what happens to those who abuse God's trust, truth, on Judgment Day. Meanwhile, Sergeant, I'll ask you to leave. You're only here on sufferance. You're not even war damage. Madam, I have my job to do. What's that? And what's this rubbish? He pulled at the string that dangled from the ceiling. It came loose, pulling half the ceiling with it. Look at all me plaster. On me best carpet. Get out or I'll send the police on you. Madam, I am the police. Have you got a search warrant? She screamed. The sergeant decided it was time to flee the foul tempter. All the way back over the river and the ferry, he tried to work out which way the little clump of trees on the north bank he'd be on the string. But there were so many clumps, it would be a long job finding it. At last came the morning when Rudy found he could walk. But walk where? To a policeman, a prison camp. It was tempting. Warm blankets, a bath, hot soup and bread, comrades who spoke German, but the problem was getting safe to the prison camp. He knew how much Garmouth had been bombed. Night after night he had lain under a thin wooden bomb roof while bombs rained down, while searchlights revolved like the spokes of giant wheels, while fires burned and the bells of fire engines clanged through the streets. People who had been bombed hated enemy flyers. Rudy had seen the capture of a British flyer in Germany. In Berlin, the first night it had been bombed, the man stumbled along between two Wehrmacht who used their fixed bayonets to keep the German civilians back. Civilians who threw stones and dog dirt at the airmen and his captors alike. One woman had leapt and screaming and clawed the fire's face. That was when the officer had ordered his soldiers to fire the rifles in the air. But suppose the soldiers had been there? There were stories of airmen hanged from lampposts, run through with pitchforks. Rudy opened the holster on his belt. Alone of his possessions, the Luger pistol was clean. That would deal with those who brought ropes and pitchforks. Then there was pain of being a prisoner. All his life, Rudy had hated being fastened in. Once he had run away from the Oberschule because the master had locked him in a cupboard. All his boyhood he roamed the streets until his mother accused him of turning into a criminal. But he was never a criminal. He had just had to be free. But where had he go to stay free? He must stick to wasteland, where no English went, old dumps and bombed houses, and he would walk to the sea, which the British called the North Sea and the Germans the German Ocean. There might be boats he could steal on a Swedish cargo ship to stow away on. It was a forlorn hope. Before he was captured or killed, he would look out once more on the sea. He closed his holster, fastened one large sack round his middle with a lump of rope, and draped another marked A1 cattle cake over his flying helmet. He must keep on his flying helmet, or else he could be shot as a spy. He thought with his new beard and mud-encrusted trousers he might pass as a tramp. He said goodbye to the rabbits and stuffed his pockets with the frozen Brussels sprouts. Then he set off, beginning to sing to himself in this peculiar monotone he had heard tramps use in his childhood. It was a bitterly cold day. Not many people were about. But, as he was cutting down a back lane, a woman came out to his husband with a dish of scraps, a stout body in a flowered apron and checkered carpet slippers. She stared at the approaching shamble figure. Rudy hummed, "Ich hat einen Kameraden" in a high-pitched whine. He looked at the scraps hungrily, cabbage and lumps of pie crust. The hands that were scraping them into the bin with a knife paused. Rudy halted and looked up, making his eyes wide as the white showed all round. "Where are you from?" asked the woman. Rudy understood her. He had done English at Oberschule, but he daredn't reply, for his accent was strong. Instead, he mouthed gibberish and pointed first to the plate, and then at his mouth. The woman's face melted from doubt to kindliness. She offered the plate timidly. Rudy crawled at the scraps and threw them into his mouth. Clawed. Even his fear they tasted marvellous. "Wait," said the woman, holding up her hand. She vanished back into the yard. Rudy wondered whether to run, but he couldn't. His ankle was too painful and the back lane was too long. He waited what seemed like a lifetime until the woman reappeared with half a loaf and a large wizened apple. Now there was a man behind her, her husband doubtless. He had a bald head, a thrusting chin, a collarless shirt, and red braces into which he stuck his thumbs aggressively. "What are you hanging around here for, pestering women?" Mirp Ugama," said Rudy earnestly. "Hush, Jack," said the woman. "Can't you see he's a dummy?" "Riff-raff," said the husband. "I shoot the likes of those. No use to the war effort at all. How much use are you? Always on the sick with your back?" asked the woman, a spark hidden in her eyes. "Leave the poor thing alone. He's not doing you any harm." She thrust a loaf and apple into Rudy's hands. "Here you are, love, and the best of luck." "Ugh, mirp," said Rudy, and shambled away. He could hear the man and woman start to quarrel as they entered the house. Rudy wandered on till he found a bombed house in a huge wooden garden. The gates were wired and together, but he got over them somehow. The house was abandoned, but it had water trickling from a burst pipe in what seemed to be the garden, and one room still had a roof, and glass in the windows. There were old pink mattresses thrown about, and torn curtains for bedding, even plenty of broken wood for fire. if he had only had matches. Why, he could live for weeks. He settled down and ate the apple and half of the bread. He made himself leave the rest till later. He'd been luckier than he deserved. The tramp disguise was working. It wouldn't have worked in Germany. There were no tramps there now. Hitler had put them into hospitals and they were never seen again. He started. Footsteps sounded in the gravel drive. He peeped down the filthy curtain. A man in a blue uniform was staring at the house. Gestapo. Did the British have Gestapo? He wore no gun, carried no truncheon, but wore a tall pointed hat. Policy. The man limped and looked very tired. Even in his own present state, Rudy felt sorry for him. It would be a pity to shoot him. Was this the moment to surrender? It was so easy. That walk to the Polizzi barracks. What could seem more harmless to hostile civilians than a Polizzi walking with an old tramp? And once in a cell, he would be safe from ropes and pitchforks. But Rudy was a gambler at heart, on horses, at cards, even on racing 2 cockroaches, and at the moment his luck was holding. He heard the sergeant enter the house, heard his heavy boots echoing from room to room, coming nearer. All Rudy could do was get behind the door, Luger in one hand, loaf of bread in the other. The door opened. The sergeant's helmeted head approached. It seemed to Rudy he was looking for something on the floor, not for a person. Rudy held his breath, finger on trigger. The door closed. Rudy waited till the footsteps receded, and then took several great panting breaths. The sergeant left the house, and went through the back. Rudy crept from room to room, watching him. The back garden was wild and huge, with old statues and urns overthrown by the bomb's blast. The sergeant began to walk around them. Down through the back fence where a mound of tumbled rubble lay under the trees. The sergeant paused, and then began to pick his way gingerly. Suddenly, his shiny boot vanished up the ankle. Damn in hell! The sergeant slipped and nearly fell, hanging onto a sundial for support. His boots were covered in thick yellow mud. He shrugged and turned back towards the house, rubbing his boots on the long grass as he came. He passed, and his footsteps faded. Immediately, Rudy felt the scale of nature. Quick! The last thing he wanted was wet trousers. But not in the house. He might be there for days. And he couldn't stand the smell of the place where someone had urinated. He'd go down to the garden, under the trees. He grinned. The mud wouldn't put him off. His flying boots would get in any mudder. With difficulty, he reached the trees. He looked back to make sure nobody was watching. Funny, that house looked familiar. Where had he seen it before? He couldn't have seen it before. He had once been on holidays in England before the war, but there was a Brighton, hundreds of miles south. You're getting delirious, comrade, he thought to himself. After he'd been along among the trees, he felt much better, and stared about. There was a little doorway in the mound of rubble, not much bigger than a rabbit hole, in fact. There was 3 doorways, all in a row. What was it? A bomb shelter? A coal cellar? Rudy couldn't resist his curiosity. He had a feeling he was being foolish, but he had to know what was down inside. Down the hole he went. He straightened up and looked straight down the barrel of a machine gun. By the light of a candle he could see the 4 helmeted figures crouching over the gun. His look had ended with a vengeance. He put up his hands as high in the air as he could push them. As he did so, the sacks fell from his waist and head.